From WAMU at American University in Washington, this is Public Interest. I'm Kojo Nnamdi. The trumpets are blaring, the tribesmen are restless, but don't worry, you're just one step away from world domination. That's how the popular computer game called Age of Empires invites players into its imaginary universe. Your goal? To create a vast empire to rule the world. Empires have long fascinated everyone from the people who design games to serious historians. It's all about power, how to get it, how to keep it. 2,000 years ago, the world was divided between the Roman and Chinese empires. After Rome fell apart in the 4th and 5th centuries, other empires came and went. Byzantine, Islam, and Western Christendom. In more recent times, the British, Ottoman, Habsburg, and arguably the U.S. empires all competed with Russia in her long quest for empire. So what does this all mean to us? What lessons should we take from this history? Why empires rise and fall, succeed in some places, fail in others? What is the legacy that they have left behind for our modern world? In order to answer all of these weighty questions, we have in our Washington studio Dominic Lieven. He is the author of the book Empire, the Russian Empire and Its Rivals. He's a former Kennedy Scholar at Harvard University. He's professor of Russian government at the London School of Economics. Among his many publications, the highly praised Nicholas II and Russia's Rulers Under the Old Regime, published by Yale University Press. Dominic Lieven, good to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me.
And it's my understanding that you have another Washington connection, and that is your brother Anatol, who is at the Carnegie Institute here in Washington.
That's right, yes, and has written a number of books on the fallout of Russian and Soviet empire.
So you managed to come here not only to talk about your own book, but to reunite with your brother.
I did.
You too can reunite or join us in this conversation by calling 1-800-433-8850. You can also email us at pi@wamu.org. To jump right into the middle of the controversy of definition, you say in the preface to this book, in this book, all I mean by empire is first and foremost a very great power that has left its mark on the international relations of an era. I also mean a polity that rules over wide territories and many peoples. Why do you keep your definition so general, so broad?
I suppose partly because what I wanted to show was that there are two great traditions of empire. The one that most people think of, which are the modern empires, the West European empires, the ones that Lenin generalized about and devised his theory of imperialism, the ones we all know best. There is, of course, another much older tradition of empire, these great absolutist land empires, sometimes aristocratic, sometimes empires of great religions. Islamic empires, for instance. And after all, not merely are they much older than the West European type, but they also lived on into this century, certainly with the Ottomans and the Habsburgs, certainly with Tsarist Russia, arguably with the Soviet Union as well. So by keeping my definition broad, I was able to bring these two rather different strands of empire together. And interestingly for me, it seems that Russia and the Soviet Union span the two.
And maybe to avoid the semantic dispute we often get into, based in part on so many scholarly writings about empire and imperialism, you mentioned Lenin, one of whose theoretical contributions to Marxism-Leninism was his definition of empire and imperialism. Under any and all of those definitions, including your own, would the present-day United States qualify as an empire?
No, I don't think so in most ways, because it seems to me that although the United States is an empire in terms of power, in certain other ways it isn't. I mean, the President of the United States does not rule without the consent of the American people. Empire has a connotation of imposed power, authoritarianism. And that, I think, doesn't really apply within the contemporary United States. But that isn't actually what matters to me. It's interesting to hold the contemporary United States up against a mirror called empire, and interesting to see the ways in which American contemporary power is or isn't different to the way that power has been used. Some of the dilemmas are the same. I mean, after all, trying to run a huge continental multicultural society has got some of the old problems of empire attached to it.
So even if one does not theoretically or technically define it as an empire, you will find aspects of empire in what goes on in the United States.
Yes, I think that's inevitable, because power will always be with us. And as long as there are international relations in the world, power will always be crucial.
Of course, the book that we're talking about, Empire, the Russian Empire and Its Rivals by Dominic Lieven, focuses on Russia, so I guess we ought to get back there after we give you the telephone number, 1-800-433-8850, or our email address, pi@wamu.org. Let's start with a personal connection. You have a personal connection to one of the great Russian aristocratic families. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how it affected your viewpoint about both the good and bad things that Russian Empire has achieved, if in fact it has affected your viewpoint?
Well, I think one's background does to some extent. One of the elements in all of this was simply, to point out just how ambiguous the term Russian was. My family wasn't Russian. God only knows what they were. They were Livonians, Germans, Swedes, bit of Russian, Irish, even on my father's side. This was a world in which, the ruling elites of great empires were usually very cosmopolitan. And that in itself is something, even without the other side of my family, which was also involved in empire in equally ambiguous ways, because they were Irish, but servants of empire from the Catholic Irish, I suppose, ascendancy. But one of them married an Indian woman and then had his wife and daughter blown up by Bengali terrorists by accident. So there's an extraordinary mishmash of different traditions which come through to us. But knowing the older members of my family on both sides certainly did make me very interested in this subject.
One of the British reviews of this book, Empire, the Russian Empire and Its Rivals, in it the reviewer says, Lieven's distaste for nationalism implies a rejection of democracy, and yet he doesn't quite have the nerve to make that rejection explicit. What do you say to that?
Well, I think, is often the case with reviews. The reviewer was slightly putting his own twist and his own, perhaps, political aspirations into my mouth. I think that, you can write a book about empire, pointing out all its problems and its fundamental illegitimacy in the contemporary world, while at the same time also pointing out that sometimes some empires, in terms of their tolerance towards peoples of different races, religions, all these kind of things, actually were superior in many ways to certain aspects of modern nationalist, democratic nationalism. Because after all, if you look, let's say, in Central Europe, the collapse of the Habsburgs and their replacement by radical German nationalism was certainly to no one's benefit. And I think you could argue as well that some of the more traditional empires, the Ottomans, for instance, to some extent even Tsarism, did less damage to the indigenous peoples they conquered than sort of the British overseas empire, whether in North America or in Australasia, where you have white settler democracy. But of course that white settler democracy is based on the expropriation of native land and the exclusion of all but non-whites from political and civil rights. So democracy and nationalism in certain contexts is, not an unequivocal benefit, unless it really does mean for everyone. And of course for everyone is difficult if the people are defined in terms of ethnic nationalism.
But in this ongoing ideological war we have, and I think where we're sitting now, Washington, D.C. is a good example of this, because Washington, D.C. is referred to by some people as the last colony of the United States, because its citizens do not have the right to have voting representation in the Congress of the United States, and there's a lot of objection to that. But in that ongoing ideological war, what seems to be the case is that if you point out the practical advantages that some empires may have had in specific situations, then there's another school of thought that says no matter what the practical advantages of empire, or in the case Washington, D.C. status, the fact is that if the citizens of that country or that nation or that city do not have self-determination, then all of the practical advantages of empire stand for naught.
Well, I think in terms of the dominant ideology in the contemporary world, which is, after all, democracy, that's quite right. You cannot justify authoritarian rule. You cannot justify empire, which is a form of authoritarian rule, in any circumstances. And yet, on the other hand, you can't apply contemporary democratic principles back across the whole of history. It's not sensible to condemn the way that an empire was run 200 years ago on the basis of our contemporary principles. And it is also worth pointing out, as I said, that in certain circumstances, for the mass of the population, there were worse fates than living under empire. Some empires. It depended.
In order to quibble with definitions for a little bit, and thankfully you made yours broad so we don't have to quibble a great deal, there are territories like Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands that are a part of the United States, and we would argue that, look, all of these people want to be a part of the United States. But I also noticed that in 1991, the majority of the Soviet republics wanted to continue to be a part of the Soviet Union. What made that an empire and this not?
Well, it's a very good question. I think, one point to stress is that empires can evolve into multi-ethnic federations. They can evolve in principle over the centuries by assimilation, even into semi-nation states. And I think it was not beyond the bounds of possibility that much of the Soviet Union might have evolved in that direction, just as before 1914 it was not beyond the bounds of possibility that Austria was going in that direction. So this business of empire and non-empire is not black and white. Political systems seldom are. But I would add that it seems to me in 1991 the Soviet Union collapses not just because it's an empire, but also because simultaneously the wretched Gorbachev is attempting to cope with the problems of ending empire and at the same time with the problems of completely transforming both the economic and the political system. That isn't easily done, and I think it was those three things together which did for the Soviet Union, as well as some rather poor political leadership.
We're talking with Dominic Lieven about his book, Empire, the Russian Empire and Its Rivals. You can join us at 1-800-433-8850 or email us at pi@wamu.org. Let's step back about 2,000 years when there were two great empires ruling the world, the Roman and the Chinese empires. Can you tell us about how those two empires have left their imprint on the modern world?
Well, I suppose the most obvious way is to say that Europe at the present moment is a collection of nation-states who are trying to build some kind of continental confederation because of the advantages of a united economic space and of the traditional advantages of empire, which means that, the European leaders want a degree of power in world affairs. They want to have a say in big environmental questions, in big questions of world trade, and they know that they'll get a bigger say if they stick together. In that sense, the European Union is attempting to create something which isn't an empire but has certain elements of empire. And the reason they're doing it is that we live in a tradition which, ever since the end of Rome, has divided Europe up. China, the exact opposite, of course, a huge continental scale country faced with all the potential disintegrative problems of, introducing capitalism, regional disparities of wealth, you name it.
So that the Roman and Chinese empires are what initiated the division that we now so casually recognize between East and West.
Certainly one of the great divisions, yes, meaning that the dominant tradition in East Asia is of one huge continental scale polity. But of course that goes along with other issues as well. One of the reasons why in China you have that is because that's what their ideology favored, one huge polity.
Again, the book, Empire, the Russian Empire and Its Rivals. The guest, the author, Dominic Lieven. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more of this discussion about empire and your phone calls and emails. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Diane Rehm. We're starting a new feature at the WAMU website. Join me for a live conversation online starting today at 2 p.m. Visit www.wamu.org to join in our first online conversation this afternoon at 2. See you there.
Support for WAMU is provided by Books A Million and booksamillion.com, now with 13 locations in the Washington area and on the web at www.booksamillion.com.
Empire. It's really a fascinating topic, whether you happen to be reading or talking about it. Today we happen to be talking about a book about empire that you can read. It's called Empire, the Russian Empire and its Rivals, and the author is our guest this hour in our Washington studio, Dominic Lieven. A conversation you can participate in by calling 1-800-433-8850 or by emailing us at pi@wamu.org. At the time that Russia was born, civilization revolved around China, the Middle East, and Christendom. When it became an empire around 1550, Russia seems to fall between the cracks of Europe and Asia in a form of isolation. What accounts for that?
Well, I think what accounts for it is partly its geographical position. It's on the eastern wing of Europe, which means that it expands across the land, which makes its empire inevitably somewhat different to the ones that we tend to know more about, the British, the French, the Spanish. It's different as well because it comes out of an Eastern Orthodox tradition. But it's not entirely different. I mean, the expansion of Russia is all part of the expansion of Europe. The people who are the victims of empire, these are Muslims, these are nomads, it's their land which gets pinched, etc. That's quite familiar from the history of other European empires as well. And just as the rise of, empire in Russia is familiar, so is its decline. It's all part of the, if you like, contraction of Europe, which is where we are now.
If indeed Russia was, because of its geographical location, in a form of isolation, what accounts for the different forces involved in forming what we now think of as the Russian national character?
Well,
who were the forces? What were the forces?
The forces, as tends to be the case, were partly the natural environment. It's in the nature of things that if you're trying to create a prosperous community amidst the snow, all the things we know about with Russia. And then again, the fact that, precisely the centres of the world were China, the Middle East, and Western Europe. All of them are a long way away from Russia. It's not where the great trade routes go. In other words, it is a periphery with all that entails, small towns, not much education. Empire in Russia was always kicking against the pricks. It was empire on the cheap, empire against many obstacles, and that too very much determines the kind of empire and the kind of people you're dealing with.
Did the Russian relationship with Europe, even back then, cause Russia to feel at some point inferior?
Look, I think everybody's relationship with Europe over the last 500 years has caused them to feel inferior with very good reason and to resent it.
I was about to say inferior and resentful.
Yep, that's right. But at the same time that you resent and feel inferior, at the same time you want the prosperity and the power, and you have to have it. Because although the Russian people have paid a very high price, for this imperial ruthless state. My God, other people have paid a high price for not being able to defend themselves against the expansion of Europe. Not least, the failure of the Ottoman Empire, the result of which has been that, Muslims have been murdered or kicked out of the great majority of areas, the northern borderlands of the Ottoman Empire in Europe, in the Transcaucasus and the Crimea. What we've seen in the last 10 years in Bosnia and in Kosovo is just the last gasp of something which has been going on for 100 years by now or more, and literally cost the lives of millions of people.
Empire and its consequences. The Soviet Union began with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. You've been quoted as saying that Marxism is a liberal Western idea. What do you mean by that?
Well, Marx himself, after all, was a German Jew. He thought that he stood in the full tradition of classical political economy, the liberals, and of course he was right in many ways. The one thing he certainly wasn't was Russian. He despised Russia. It was a great irony that his ideology should be taken up by the Russians of all people.
He called Marxism-Leninism, or it was really a combination of what German philosophy, British political economy, I guess, and French socialism.
Yes, and of course
all Western Europe.
Yes, and then when you add Leninism, then, of course, it becomes something which is also wrapped up with the particular sort of messianic, strange psychology of the Russian intelligentsia, and then once you get to Stalin and actually founding a state, then it takes on the Russian state tradition as well. But it is ultimately part of the whole West European modernizing, vision.
How did Marxism-Leninism play out in dealing with non-Russian people in the Soviet Empire compared to a more traditionally Western empire like the one ruled by the British?
Well, I mean, both the British and the Soviet empires are modern empires with, at least in principle, a commitment to improvement. In other words, educating people, modernizing the world, building railways, you name it. The Soviet setup is much more wholehearted in its commitment to this modernization. By 1985, Soviet Central Asia is far ahead of most of the Third World in terms of education, prosperity, you name it. But of course there's a price to be paid for that as well, which is, ecological devastation, awful problems in terms of, imposing this economic system, collectivization, all the things we know about. So like most things in history, there are pluses and minuses.
The number again, 1-800-433-8850. I think we should go to the telephones because we have a number of callers waiting. Let us start with Orion in Southern Oregon. Orion, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, you just got to the subject I was generally going to talk about, and that is the period after Vladimir Ilyich Lenin takes over in the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, and when Joe Stalin overthrows his heir apparent in the form of Lev Davidovich Bronstein, who is better known as Leo Trotsky. And you find a very different image of the area in that relatively small period.
What your point or question is, Orion, is?
I just wanted to hear your speaker talk about the differences, the Trotsky's big influence, the semi-democratic thing he was setting up, especially in the 20s, and the human civil rights stuff that he was working with through Lenin, that
this is Trotsky?
Rolled back in 1926 with the consolidation of all these neighboring countries into the Soviet Union.
Awfully detailed information for a project of this size dealing with empire over centuries, but Dominic, Lieven, the question is really directed at you.
I think it's true that in the 1920s, the Soviet setup allowed very considerable cultural autonomy and considerable opportunities for social mobility, acquiring top jobs in the republics to non-Russians, and that made it very different to most, in fact, to almost any traditional empire. That, I don't think, is something that Stalin disagrees with. I don't think the differences are enormous between him and Lenin at that point. And I don't think actually Trotsky either stood for anything fundamentally different to that. The big changes come with Stalin acquiring supreme power, the late 20s and 30s, but I think they're linked not just to Stalin, but also to the difficulties of the project that they were involved in. They'd allowed so much cultural autonomy, so much social mobility, so much room for nationalism, that they began to get very scared that the whole thing was going to spin out of control. And Stalin represses some of these nationalist developments.
Orion, thank you very much for your call. You've written, indeed, on this subject that the greatest problem of empire was that its scale made self-government impossible. It seems to me that one of the seeds of destruction for most empires is, well, the native ruling class in each territory or each colony. Could you tell us a little bit about what you call the law of colonial ingratitude and how it played out both in the Soviet Union compared to the British Empire?
The law of colonial ingratitude tends to mean that the colonial Western power, or in the case of the Soviet Union, of course, the Soviet regime, educates a a new middle class or a intelligentsia, which then applies against the imperial power the principles of democracy, self-determination, which the imperial power has taught it. So you get people in Africa telling the French that they too believe in liberty, equality and fraternity, and therefore why is France ruling Africa? The same thing is happening at the end in the Soviet Union. And I think, the Republican elites created by the Soviet Union itself are enormously important in its destruction under Gorbachev.
The concept of the law of colonial ingratitude, as it's played out both in the Soviet Union and the British Empire, allow us to get back to the telephone to Philip in Tacoma Park, Maryland. Philip, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Kojo. I've been on your program before. I'd like to draw a very stark difference with Mr. Lieven in the sense of the United States, that the United States is not only an empire by intent, land acquisition and military takeover and the creation of a global empire under Admiral Mahan, but in terms of your definition of democracy as a contradiction to empire, I think we actually have an imperial democracy or a democratic imperialism that is far more sophisticated and therefore far more devastating than other forms of empire that are much more obvious. And I think that what's happening... You're saying that it's more devastating simply because... It's devastating because of its psychological control over the people. We have both the Republican and Democratic presidents who are elected by the people, and they both fully endorse empire all the way through their regimes on a consistent basis. So the election of either Democratic or Republican presidents doesn't alter the impact and power of the imperialists upon the people, even though the people don't know that they're actually being controlled. But most of our foreign policy is controlled by the imperial powers, and this goes back to the whole question of Madison that you just mentioned. Madison's whole theory, which he sold to Jefferson reluctantly, was make it big and it can't be controlled by any one faction, meaning it really can't be controlled by democracy because it's too big for... So you're saying that it's possible to have both democracy and empire in the same place, and because of the existence of this democracy, or what you call imperial democracy, that by definition it makes the empire even more dangerous and devastating. Allow me to have Dominic Lieven respond.
I think one point is that democracy, as it was represented in the United States, meaning white settler democracy, was devastating for those who were excluded, which above all means the indigenous people. It is the white electorate itself, the majority of the population, who are the great imperialists in that sense. It's not a question of some elite depriving the indigenous peoples of their land. So in that sense, the idea that the bulk of the electorate are the victims of empire is, I think, pushed too far. In terms of, what it seems to me you're talking about as regards the electorate is the reality of consent. And of course we all know that in democratic systems, consent is a pretty dubious concept very often. Nevertheless, it does seem to me that there is a fundamental difference between the relationship of the bulk of the American population to power and that of, let us say, Indian subjects of British rule, or indeed the peoples of the Soviet Union to the regime created by Lenin and Stalin, or indeed to the tsarist regime before them. That, I think, is a significant difference between empire and not empire.
This is Public Interest. I'm Kojo Nnamdi. Your turn, Philip. Philip, are you there? Oh, I think Philip thought that he was cut off, and so he hung up. Unfortunately, we cannot continue that dialogue with Philip, but we can continue it with Elliot in St. Joseph, Missouri. Elliot, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Kojo, love your show.
Thank you.
My question for Dominic is that in the ancient times, empires were deemed to be something that could protect the people and be a good thing. But nowadays, they seem to be an evil, dubious form of government. Besides the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, what other examples are there of people where people have changed their minds and attitudes towards empires, and what set them in motion?
Indeed, you raise a very good question, Elliot, because there's a difference between how empire, according to this book, was regarded in medieval Europe and how it was regarded in, say, the Western world in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Go right ahead, please.
Well, the key change is that from the French Revolution and from the early 19th century, when you have doctrines of nationalism emerging, has developed a world in which democracy and nationalism are the dominant ideologies. Empire sins against both. And it's the fact, as Francis Fukuyama quite rightly said, that these ideologies now completely dominate, which makes empire no longer acceptable. So that even if you are, or have nasty elements of empire to your polity, as I think the present People's Republic of China does, you're very careful indeed not to call yourself an empire, despite the fact that you still claim the right to every territory which was ever conquered by the Qing dynasty.
Does this mean that this is the first time in human history that empire was universally considered distasteful?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, in the past, empires have risen and fallen, but empire itself has been a perfectly legitimate form of government. Nowadays, it isn't.
Do sentiments for empire reside, nevertheless, within people and within leaders, whether they happen to be elected or dictatorial leaders, and they just use different words, because there are clearly still tendencies toward expansionism in the world?
I think there are less tendencies now than there used to be to territorial expansionism, and that's to do with the nature of the contemporary economy, and that's another reason why empire doesn't make sense nowadays. It's perfectly logical. In the past, until relatively recently, to think that your country would become more powerful and more prosperous if it could absorb more and more peoples and territories. Nobody but an idiot believes that nowadays, and that is one reason why empire, again, is less legitimate. But on the other hand, if you're looking, for instance, even at democratic societies like Western Europe, the desire of Western European elites to create a European Union has got something to do with the traditional motivations of empire. They want to count in the world. They want to have a say. They don't want to be just pushed around by Washington when, for instance, it's a question of world trade or it's a question of environmentalism or all sorts of other issues. The whole logic still is pooling resources, continental scale, in order to be powerful. That doesn't mean the European Union is an empire. It does mean it's got some of the elements of empire to it.
Well, there are those people who clearly believe, as demonstrations in North America have shown, that elements of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the whole notion of getting together to talk about world trade, really represents the emergence of a new form of empire. How would you respond?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think that people who say that are exaggerating. But I think they're not necessarily entirely wrong. What I would say is that there is a distinction between the present global order, run to some extent by the United States, by the IMF, the World Bank, and traditional empire. After all, when the Chinese didn't want to trade in the 19th century, Lord Palmerston sent gunboats to blow their defences down. Nowadays, it's not that the IMF is going to send a fleet to break its way into Burma and ensure that trade goes on. It's more to the point that everybody in the world really does tend to believe, certainly leaderships of the world tend to believe, that if you stay out of the global economy, you haven't got a chance in terms of modernisation, prosperity, you name it. But of course, if you come into somebody else's game in which powerful countries run things, and you have to obey their rules.
Elliot in St. Joseph, thank you for your call.
And thank you.
We're talking with Dominic Lieven about his book, Empire, the Russian Empire and Its Rivals. We're going to take a short break. We'll be right back.
National broadcast of public interest is made possible in part by the members of WAMU and its underwriters, including United Airlines. Additional support for National Public Radio comes from NPR stations and the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, the Geraldine R. Dodge Foundation for reporting on biological resource issues, and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, supporting families and neighborhoods by funding initiatives aimed at helping disadvantaged children. On the web at aecf.org. This is NPR, National Public Radio.
Democrats assume control of the Senate this week in a major political upheaval. GOP Senator Fred Thompson is trying to stay calm.
It's not the end of the world. There's some feeling that we may have gotten bit by our own dog, but that happens from time to time.
I'm Juan Williams. Exactly what will change when Democrats take control of the Senate? That's the next Talk of the Nation from NPR News.
Today at 2 on WAMU 88.5 FM. Join us for WAMU in your ward.
Which ward?
Ward 8.
When's it all happening?
The taping is on June 14th at 7 p.m. at the Allen Chapel AME Church. That's at 2498 Alabama Avenue Southeast.
And you don't need reservations. You just have to show up.
But if you want more information, you can call 202-885-8873 or visit our website.
On the computer thing.
WAMU.org. That's WAMU in your ward. Recorded Thursday, June 14th, 7 p.m. for the D.C. Politics Hour with Mark Plotkin on WAMU 88.5 FM.
Join WAMU tonight for Washington's most comprehensive international news coverage. At 11, it's As It Happens, the news magazine that provides Canadian insight to American news. Then at midnight, the BBC's The World Today analyzes the issues behind the headlines. And at 2, the World Radio Network brings you 3 hours of news and analysis from Hungary to the Netherlands. That's the international news lineup weeknights from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. here on WAMU 88.5 FM.
Our guest is Dominic Lieven. He is author of the book Empire, the Russian Empire and Its Rivals. This is Public Interest. We take your telephone calls at 1-800-433-8850, your emails at pi@wamu.org. We got an email from Martin, Dominic, who says, the Japanese wanted to extend their empire in part because of what they saw in China with European spheres of influence. What was the difference between the Japanese and Chinese empires?
The Japanese empire was based, as you quite rightly said, on a Western imperialist model. They were simply copying the West European powers and deciding they were going to muscle in themselves and try and create their own monopoly sphere in what was, after all, their own Asian part of the world. Chinese empire, rather different. This is a great land empire linked to a great civilization covering, much of East Asia since very, very early times. And therefore, for China, the principles of empire are rather different to those that run a 19th and 20th century industrial expansionist trading power.
How important is it for the Bush administration in its dealings with China to be acutely aware of that history of empire and how it may, even today, affect consciousness in general in China and the consciousness of the leadership in particular?
Well, I think it is important, and I think it's an interesting issue, empire in China, because on the one hand, the Chinese have an enormously arrogant tradition of imagining they're the center of the universe, and are not at all happy to be cheated by anybody in the neighborhood. On the other hand, of course, they have a perfectly well-justified sense that in the 20th century they were the victims of empire, of Japan in particular, but of the other Western imperialist powers. So they are bound to be, just on that basis, quite difficult people to cope with, quite apart from the fact that they do, after all, have another problem of empire, which is particularly a problem of communist empire. When you have these vast continental polities, and they are also run by communist centralized economic systems, when you begin introducing a free market, you get enormous regional disparities. And of course, that is one of the big problems they're facing right now, holding on to, this rapidly expanding coastal area while trying to shift its resources to rescue impoverished areas in the hinterland. Not easy.
One of the problems of centralism. Steve in Gaithersburg, Maryland, you're on the air. Steve, go ahead, please.
Yes, I apologize. I turned on late if you've already answered this, but I was wondering if Dominic might comment on whether Reagan was responsible for the collapse of the Soviet evil empire or whether it was already on life support and collapsed under its own weight.
Thank you for your call, Steve.
Well, I think the Soviet empire collapsed for two reasons, partly because it was based on socialism and Soviet-style socialism didn't work, and partly because the Russians took on a competition with virtually the whole of the rest of the world, including societies like the United States and Western Europe, which were much richer and more dynamic than the Soviet Union. So they were hugely overburdened by this competition. But it does come down in the end to the failure of an ideology. The economic system was rooted in a conception of how you run an economy, which was mad and didn't work. I think Reagan gave him the last push, but I would say that it obviously goes deeper than just him and his policies.
Steve, thank you for your call.
Thank you.
Since you raised the issue of ideology, obviously if you're comparing empires, the Ottoman Empire lasted a whole lot longer than the Soviet one. However, you have written that both of them were, quote-unquote, splendid ideologies of empire, and that Islam and Soviet communism were the greatest external challenges that the West has thus far faced. Can you explain those remarks?
Well, I think in terms of the last one, it's simply that for the first 1,000 years of its existence, Islam was on the whole more dynamic than Christianity. It, after all, conquered the whole of the southern shore of the Mediterranean, on 2 occasions almost broke its way into the absolute heartlands of Europe. And I think if you looked at the world in the 16th century, as indeed the Habsburg ambassador in Constantinople wrote, it was entirely possible to predict that it would be Islam which would dominate into the next era. And of course, that situation was then reversed in the 17th, 18th centuries, and it's not until the 20th century that you get another really major challenge, which is the communist one. And that's all I meant on that basis. Well, when I was talking about these being splendid imperial ideologies, all I meant was that if you're going to run an empire, what you want to have is some great supranational ideology, some great value system.
Internationalism.
Exactly. And Islam has been splendid in that way, and potentially, of course, once you ditched religion, what the Soviet Union came up with was the greatest of the 20th century secular religion, socialism.
On to Tom in Winchester, Virginia. Tom, your turn.
Thank you, Kojo, for taking my call. And Dominic, Dominic, I'd like to ask you about focusing on the repressive nature of the Soviet Empire. I'd like to ask you about a book and a movie, a documentary that were produced in the mid or late 80s about the Ukraine and the Ukrainian famine during 1933-34. When Stalin withdrew all the wheat from the Ukraine, and approximately 8 to 10 million Ukrainians starved to death based on their refusal to organize into communes and their attachment to their family farms. I know that in the mid or late 80s, the New York Times issued an apology because of suppression of that information by journalists through that era, and I'd just like to get your comments on that.
And if you can add to that a comparison of the cruelties of one empire as compared to the next.
Well, there's no question that the Ukrainian famine was a catastrophe. There's also no question that it was a deliberate policy by the Soviet government which caused it. It wasn't a natural catastrophe. And the Soviet regime refused to actually provide assistance to the starving, or indeed to allow anyone else to. At the same time, the Ukrainians were not alone. There was a very severe famine in the North Caucasus, which mostly hit Russians, but others as well. And there was an even worse disaster in Kazakhstan, where roughly a third of the population was wiped out in 18 months. So this was the price that the Soviet regime imposed, above all on the non-Russians, but also on the non-Russians, in this era of, very rapid industrial development. In terms of the cruelties compared to, it's a difficult one. You could argue, you can turn it round, if you like, and say that at least the nomads who stood in the way of Russian expansion, the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz, do actually have their own state. They are now members of, etc., whereas their equivalents who stood in the way of English overseas expansion are the poor wretched, Australasian Aboriginals and the native peoples of the United States who certainly don't have their own countries, their own place in the United Nations, etc. So, as always with historical comparisons, it rather depends which end you look at things.
Are atrocities, and if not atrocities, policies that lead to large numbers of people dying and suffering a characteristic of empires?
Not always, I think. Not always. I think that would be unfair.
Oh, and Tom, thank you for your call.
Okay, thank you.
Go right ahead.
I think it depends. One of the distinctions between the European overseas expansion, that type of empire, actually has got nothing to do with greater wickedness or anything like that. It's simply to do with the fact that Europeans expanded outside their own ecological zones. And the great majority of victims of overseas expansion died of diseases, which Europeans brought with them and against which they had no defences. In that sense, Russia was different because they were expanding overland into one single ecological zone. So you didn't usually have these huge catastrophic losses from diseases. which were so marked a part of overseas expansion.
Dominic Lieven is the author of the book Empire, the Russian Empire and Its Rivals. If you're trying to order the book and want to know how to spell his name, it's D-O-M-I-N-I-C, Dominic. Lieven is spelled L-I-E-V-E-N. It's Dominic Lieven, the book Empire, the Russian Empire and Its Rivals. The phone number for your calls, 1-800-433-8850. The email address, pi@wamu.org. We got an email from Melanie, who was visiting a recent exhibition on early photography in India, and says that she noticed that the interest that British anthropologists of the time showed in studying India's caste system. Melanie says she was struck by how similar this caste system is to the British class system. Would you ask Dominic, did this similarity of social systems between conqueror and conquered have any impact on the outcome or duration of the British Empire in India? Does this theme of quote-unquote social similarity have any other examples in other empires?
What I think you do find in terms of social similarity is more the relationship between the British ruling elites and the ruling elites of many of their colonies. You know, after all, so many of these people who conquered India, apart from anything else, came from the aristocracies of Ireland and of Scotland, these rather impoverished landowning families, who actually were doing not much different in India to what they'd traditionally done at home. So there, I think you do have a similarity. But I would be slow to equate class and caste, you know. Caste is a complicated business. And actually, I think in many ways, the whole point about caste from the British point of view was firstly that it seemed completely bizarre to them. And secondly, though, once they got their minds around it, it was their way of trying to impose their own version of order so that they could understand how Indian society operated, and therefore, to an extent, so they could run it more efficiently in their own interests.
This is Public Interest. I'm Kojo Nnamdi. The Russian and Habsburg empires seem to have gotten both of their starts around the same time in the 1550s and had similar lifespans. The Habsburg Empire collapsed in 1918 after 4 years of total war. Tell us a little bit about the consequences in Europe at the end of Habsburg rule.
The consequences are pretty devastating. One element of empire is so-called diasporas. In other words, you have peoples who spread across a whole empire and then are left stranded when that empire collapses and becomes a lot of little states, often rather nationalistic and introspective. The two biggest diasporas of the Habsburg Empire were the Germans and the Jews. As a result of the collapse of the empire and the international chaos which followed, admittedly, it took a generation for that chaos to work out fully. But as a result of that, the German diaspora is destroyed. They are virtually all thrown out of the countries where they live. Many of them die in the process. And of course the poor wretched Jews are entirely exterminated. That brings home some of the terrifying consequences of the collapse of empire. And it was, after all, one of the points of writing this book, to point out that awful though many results of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the traumas of the 1990s have been, by the standards of imperial collapse, we've so far been extremely lucky.
A point that, given the heated environment around the Cold War, is often difficult to appreciate because we tend to focus so much on what's contemporary or recent.
I think that's right, and I think it would be worthwhile standing back a bit and remembering just how lucky we've been before we all throw too many eggs at each other about the failures of policy in the 1990s.
You've written that two factors should be examined in looking at the destruction of an empire, external and internal factors. From 1945 to 1991, the Soviet Union was recognized as one of the world's two superpowers. From the West's point of view, that superpower seemed to implode in 1991. Can you tell us a little bit about how it collapsed? And you did mention some of that earlier in response to a question about whether it was Ronald Reagan who destroyed it. But more importantly, whether there has been a precedent for such an end to an empire before in world history.
I think it's very strange that an empire which was so powerful and which had such formidable coercive forces apart from anything else, collapsed with barely a shot fired in its defense. That is really remarkable. Most empires collapse in the middle of war. Their collapse brings on civil war, you name it. So I think it was remarkable, and it was in many ways unprecedented, and that is part of the reason why so few people predicted it happening in the way and at the time that it did. The key precipitant is undoubtedly Gorbachev. The Soviet Union could have survived for another generation had he not attempted to reform it, and in reforming it, undermine many of the factors which kept it together.
So his attempts at reformation was one of the major factors in the ultimate collapse.
Yes, indeed it was, and that's an important principle in general. You know, when you look at world history over these enormous spans, you tend to forget how much individual human beings can matter. But I did try and say in my book as well, if you look at the beginning of the Chinese imperial tradition, one man, the first emperor, was enormously important in actually creating the institutions and the principles of government, which in many ways have underlain Chinese government ever since. Just the same way Gorbachev played an enormous role, and in many ways a positive one, in the collapse of the Soviet Union, because he did play a big role in ensuring that that collapse came more or less peacefully, and with a strong eye to trying to preserve some degree of legality, constitutional law, during the period of collapse.
And I'm afraid we're out of time in what has been a fascinating discussion with Dominic Lieven about his book, Empire, the Russian Empire and Its Rivals. Dominic Lieven, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Public Interest is produced by Diane Vogel, Terry Cross Davis, and John Haas. Diane Vogel is the managing producer. Our engineer is Jonathan Cherry. Dory Annisman is on the phones. You can visit the Public Interest website at www.wamu.org or email us at pi@wamu.org. The theme music for Public Interest is produced and composed by Lenny Williams. This has been Public Interest. I'm Kojo Nnamdi.
Thanks for listening to the Kojo Nnamdi Show, and if you're already a member of WAMU 88.5, thank you for your support. If not, it's easy to give online at wamu.org. Just click the donate button, and thanks.